Good. Thank you very much to everyone for coming. Today I'm going to speak about Northwest Caucasian languages. But first, let me briefly recapitulate the results of our previous seminar. So polysynthesis shows a very considerable internal cross-linguistic variation, and the parameters of this variation are such as which types of incorporation and verb rule serialization a language has, if at all, which types of so-called lexical affixes are present and how productive they are, or which kind of morphological organization it follows, such as scope-ordered or templatic or various combinations of these two, what the extent of head marking is, ranging from polypersonal, which is usually associated with polysynthesis, to even apersonal, which is still found in some languages showing all other polysynthetic properties. Other possible parameters of variation that I haven't discussed include degrees of morphological and morphophonological opacity, of lexicalization of complex morphology, if you wish, and many others. Besides that, polysynthesis is also a fuzzy notion, because if we look carefully at languages, we see that all or almost all properties usually associated with polysynthesis also manifest themselves in the languages that are not usually considered polysynthetic. Well, they manifest themselves probably not to such a great degree, but still, if it's a matter of degree, then the notion is fuzzy. But this should not surprise or embarrass us, because if we take a diachronic perspective, it is clear that any polysynthetic, or for that matter, complex morphological feature takes extended time to develop and accumulate, and it develops gradually. And let me recall the distinction between what Fortescue calls newer and older polysynthesis, which can be traced in different languages mostly via observing their synchronic properties. So today we shall have a closer look at the manifestations of polysynthesis in the Northwest Caucasian language family, the one which I have worked on primarily. And I'm glad that in the audience that there is at least one person who also has worked on this language family. So let me start with a brief overview of the family. Northwest Caucasian, or Abkhaz-Adige, is one of the three indigenous language families of the Caucasus, alongside North Dagestanian or East Caucasian and Kartvelian or South Caucasian. The family consists of three branches: the Circassian branch, comprising West Circassian, also known as Adige, and Kabardian; the Abkhaz-Abaza branch, consisting of Abkhaz and Abaza, and in some way both of these branches within themselves are, or at least used to be, dialectal continua. The third branch, now extinct, is Ubykh. And even though each branch itself isn't very deep in time, the whole family is quite old. These three branches aren't very closely related, although their relationship is beyond any reasonable doubt. Moreover, and slightly more hypothetically, or probably significantly more hypothetically, there have been hypotheses put forward that the Northwest Caucasian languages are distantly related to the East Caucasian, the Dagestanian family, most notably by Sergei Nikolaev and Sergei Starostin in their monumental North Caucasian etymological dictionary. But I'm not going to discuss any of these deep historical hypotheses here. West Caucasian peoples and languages have severely suffered during the Caucasian War, led by the Russian Empire for more than a whole century, which has resulted in expulsions and forced resettlements, often quite bloody and atrocious. And as a result of this, a number of varieties have become extinct, and the whole linguistic landscape has been severely disrupted. So you might compare this map, which shows the approximate geographical distribution of the family by the end of the 18th century, when the war began. You see a more or less continuous, a large, more or less continuous area occupied by various Circassian, Abaza, and Abkhaz tribes. And compare it with the following map showing the modern geographical distribution, where you see, well, the languages are more or less in the same places. However, the areas occupied by the speakers are small patches of land, mostly disconnected from each other, from one another, are interspersed by areas mostly populated by other peoples, most notably Russians. So geographically, the four still spoken languages are located in this way. So this is West Circassian or Adige. This is Kabardyan or East Circassian, and there is a notable presence of Western Kabardyan dialects in the area where West Circassian is spoken. This is Abkhaz, and this is Abaza, again spoken in those areas where Kabardyan is spoken, and there has been prolonged and intense language contact between the two languages. Currently, the languages of the Northwest Caucasian family are spoken by about 700,000 to 800,000 people living in Abkhazia and the Russian republics of Adygea, Karacháyevo-Cherkessia, and Kabardino-Balkaria, as well as in neighboring regions. But there is also a large Northwest Caucasian diaspora in Turkey and other countries of the Middle East. But the problem is the exact number of speakers is unknown. So if we consider the whole, what is called ethnic population, the number of people who identify themselves as Circassians or Abkhaz or Abaza, so the number of those is definitely more than 1 million, probably even several million people. However, the proportion of those of them who actually speak the languages, their ancestral languages, is definitely much smaller. I won't talk about sociolinguistics anymore, and will turn to the grammatical properties. So the major typological traits of the Northwest Caucasian family are rich consonantism and impoverished vocalism. So they are really famous for their phonology, and they have been studied by many phonologists and phoneticians. But again, this is something I'm not at all an expert on, and I won't touch upon it at all, also because it doesn't have any clear relationship to polysynthesis. They are head marking and polysynthetic. They show ergativity in their morphology and also in some parts of their syntax. They show a weak distinction between major lexical classes, most notably between nominals and verbs, which could be a topic for a separate discussion, which I won't touch upon. They are characterized by a rich system of spatial marking in the verb, and this is clearly related to polysynthesis, and I'll discuss it in some detail. And also by a complex system of clause combining, which will be touched upon in next seminar. So sources of my data include materials coming from my colleagues' fieldwork, which we have been doing since 2004 on West Circassian, on several varieties of West Circassian and several varieties of Cambodian spoken in Adygea, and also on Baza. And examples include both elicited material and those coming from corpora, from text that we have recorded. So let me introduce the Northwest Caucasian way of being polysynthetic in the most general fashion. So here is a polysynthetic predicate from Beslenay Cambodian. It consists of many morphemes, and if you wish, each word in the English translation corresponds to one or several morphemes. So there is a subordinator and absolutive case marker, or agent argument, in this case expressed as an indirect object because there is a benefactive applicative working as a potential marking expressing that this can, ability, also a tense marker, negation, and a number of spatial markers related to the notion of untying and also to untying from somewhere. There is a root or sandwich between a long array of prefixes and several suffixes. There is an object in the absolutive position in the very beginning of the word, and again a number of spatial morphemes.
Reflective is?
Yeah, reflective is a very frequent suffix in these languages, which denotes things like back and again. And in this case, it certainly relates to this notion of undoing something, so doing something back. But it will also occur in many examples, which I will show also in other functions. Importantly, polysynthesis in Northwest Caucasian languages is not limited to just verbs. Nominals in these languages can also be polysynthetic, but in a different way. So this is a polysynthetic nominal from the same variety from Western Cambodian. So it has possessive prefixes to the left. It has case suffix to the right. And if it were in the plural, then the number suffix would also be to the right. But in the midst of it, between these two, there is a complex and potentially quite long string of elements, which is called the nominal complex. So an intensifier, an adjective, and two more nominal noun-like elements. And they are all composed in a more or less strict order and in a highly compositional and productive fashion. So polysynthesis in Northwest Caucasian manifests itself both in verbs and in nominals, but in different ways. For verbs are characterized by polypersonalism and complex and often lexicalized affixation patterns, whereas nominals rather show extensive and highly productive compounding. But still note that the borderline between verbs and nominals is vague, and although I'm not going to discuss it, in principle, it is possible to take a complex nominal and embed it into some kind of verbal morphology. So the most detailed discussion of the nominal complex for any Northwest Caucasian language so far is Arkadiev Lander's paper on Northwest Caucasian. And there is also a nice generative paper by Ksenia Yershova, whom I will quote several times today and next week, showing that there are indeed different morphosyntactic mechanisms beyond the verbal and the nominal varieties of polysynthesis, also in Circassian, but I think that it can be extended to the other languages of the family. Further, I will focus on verbs, although nominal polysynthesis in these languages is important and fascinating, but we simply don't have time for all the phenomena that are important and fascinating. So polysynthetic features of Northwest Caucasian verbs include the following. The first is exuberant polypersonalism, which I'll show in a minute. The second is a rich system of locative affixes, which I have already mentioned, but also there are other types of affixes with different degrees of lexicality, if you wish, and also productivity. In terms of morphological organization, these languages show an intricate mixture of templating and layered types. And importantly, there is also a complex system of morphological expression of syntactic information, or to put it in a different way, all or almost all of this complex morphology interacts with syntax and serves as employed for syntactic purposes in various ways. And we'll talk about it mostly next time. So let me start with polypersonalism and head marking. This is an example from an Abaza text. This is a single verbal form, and it is translated as, I will tell this to him about you. Of course, there is some context, but it's actually a single sentence. There isn't, I didn't, as far as I recall, I haven't omitted any noun phrases. Everything is clear from the context. Who will tell what, whom, and to whom. So there are 4 participants indexed in this verb, the subject, the agent in the ergative position before the root, the object, what is going to be told, in the absolutive position in the very beginning of the word, but also there are 2 further participants, the addressee, the indirect object, which is an obligatory argument of this verb, and also an additional argument are those about whom, or actually it's not 100% clear from the context whether it is about or whether it is for your sake, and even in this context it's not even so important. Anyway, this is some kind of a benefactive participant, and it is also encoded in this verb on top of everything else. And again, this isn't a constructed example. It occurs in a text in a position where this kind of a verbal form is appropriate and perfectly embedded in its discourse context. So if we take a larger picture of polypersonalism in Northwest Caucasian, so 3 participant forms are fairly common. So basically, if you have a verb like give, which is quite frequent in texts, you just don't have any other choice but to encode all 3 participants. And the same is basically about verbs like say something, tell something to someone, or causatives from transitive verbs, which are also not infrequent. However, 4 participant forms like the one I've just shown are also, they aren't common. Well, so far in our very small Abasa corpus, the form which I have just shown is the only unequivocally 4 participant form that's found there. But still, they are attested in texts, and in Circassian texts, we also find them. Moreover, at least in Circassian, even 5 participant forms can be constructed and parsed by speakers. Moreover, they are reported in grammars of Circassian languages, including those grammars that are written by native speaker linguists. And actually, as far as I remember, one can also find 5 participant forms in the corpus. However, for Abkhaz-Abaza, it has been claimed that 4 arguments is the limit. Still, 4 is more than it is commonly assumed, because actually the Northwest Caucasian polypersonalism seems to be a prima facie counterexample to the not infrequent claims in the theoretical literature that predicates in natural languages cannot take more than 3 arguments. And here I quote Leonard Bebe's book, where he shows on the data from various languages that it's not just that you can't have verbs that have more than 3 arguments based on the lexical meaning. No, Bebby claims that if you causativize verbs like give, for instance, you have to do something with the remaining arguments. You can't have 3 arguments, more than 3 arguments in a causative construction as well. But for Northwest Caucasian, this logic simply doesn't work. Because, well, indeed, no lexical root in these languages takes more than 3 arguments. Moreover, one can claim that in Circassian languages, lexical roots can't take more than 2 arguments. Because even in these languages, even verbs like give have an applicative that introduces the recipient. However, the point is that you can add a 4th argument and even a 5th one if needed. Now let's come back to our Abaza example a little more closely. Because what we see here is that 2 of the personal prefixes corresponding to the indirect objects are followed by some extra morphemes. And so I'm not going to discuss this so-called dative marker, which follows the recipient argument. But I'd like to draw your attention to the benefactive marker, which follows the oblique object. These second plural indirect object about you. So polypersonalism in Northwest Caucasian is facilitated, if you wish, made possible by a rich system of semantically specialized applicative markers that introduce indirect objects. And this ability to add arguments to a predicate without affecting those arguments that are already present has been called by Johanna Nichols open head marking, and this is a nice term. So Northwest Caucasian languages are not simply head marking languages. They show open head marking. That is head marking that is flexible enough to accommodate more arguments than a lexical root allows for. So applicatives in Northwest Caucasian are a very important part of verbal morphology and also of syntax. They are very numerous. Up to several dozen or even more in Abaza and Abkhaz. It depends on how one counts. So they don't normally affect the core arguments, and they combine with all types of verbs, transitive and intransitive alike. Semantically, they range from underspecified to highly specialized. In many cases, they are obligatory, and often they tend to be lexicalized. And they even allow stacking and limited recursion. So let me show you some of these. So this is an example of applicative stacking in West Circassian. So there are 2 applicative complexes. Each applicative complex consists of an applicative morpheme and their personal prefix that it corresponding to the argument that it introduces. But it's important to bear in mind that in Circassian third person singular prefixes are 0. So here we have for you benefactive and together with us comitative, and these applicatives co-occur in the same verbal form. It is even possible to stack one and the same applicative on itself, as in this example. I write to him benefactive for their benefit, or probably I write to them for his benefit. This example is actually ambiguous. And well, but note that these two instances of benefactive are not exactly synonymous. And probably it is the polysemy of the benefactive that makes it possible to stack these two applicatives. To have the two instances of the same morpheme in the word. These examples show semantically specialized locative applicatives in a buzzer. These examples are no longer elicited, they come from texts. So there are applicatives like do something among something or somebody. Like in 6, I chose a wife among them. Or applicative meaning behind, like the verb follow is literally going behind somebody. And these locative morphemes work as applicatives in that they introduce the indirect object, which is cross-referenced by the appropriate personal prefix. So head marking in Northwest Caucasian is a pervasive phenomenon of the morphology syntax interface, and it interacts with other components of grammar, including valency changing operations, and also the lexicon, because many applicatives also work as derivational morphemes. They change the meaning of the verb, creating new lexemes. And we will take some of these aspects up in the next lecture. The next topic is affixation and its relation to incorporation. So Northwest Caucasian languages have lexical affixes from many of the domains of the ontology proposed by Johannes, such as direction and position, body parts, degree, reversative and repetitive, disreflective, which I have already mentioned, just and only, affixes expressing phasal meanings such as incorporative and continuative, modalities such as possibility and necessity, but also certain notions that were apparently not mentioned by Matheson, such as similitude and subjective evaluation. Let me show some examples. So this is an example of a verbal form from ubich with a string of affixes. I don't know whether it is elicited or extracted from some text. So that is again a reflective, meaning back. There is a completive, meaning completely, and there is a abilitative or potential, meaning be able to, and they occur in the order that reflects their semantic scope. This is an elicited verbal form from a buzzer, and I must confess that it takes some efforts and tricks on the part of the linguist to elicit such forms, and speakers find them funny. Well, they say that we don't. Well, it's possible. Yes, it's possible. It's grammatical. We can interpret it, but we don't normally talk in this fashion. But still, it's not something absolutely impossible. So there is an affix expressing speakers discontent or pity, the depreciative, something translated like unfortunately. An affix, a restrictive affix, in this case meaning just, an affix meaning excessive realization of the activity, and repetitive, which actually consists of two morphemes, one of which is prefixal and another suffixal. So affixes like these, and also like the applicatives shown above, they do not fit well into the classification of morphological phenomena into derivation versus inflection, which has been criticized by many linguists, and here I want to mention Andrew Spencer and Martin Hospenmont. Indeed, they are derivation-like because, well, in that they are optional, and they express rather concrete semantic content. At the same time, they are inflection-like in that, at least in principle, they are highly productive. They are also fully compositional, and importantly, they are able to create clearly ad hoc forms. Well, no one would reasonably claim that, unfortunately, just having done something excessively, or no, unfortunately, just having fried something excessively is a distinct lexical entry in Vaza. Well, or for that matter, even something much simpler like frying something excessively. It's not a separate lexical entry. It's a compositional combination of a productive suffix with a root. So in this way, these affixes are similar to inflection. And of course, here we can recall the notion of productive and inflectional concatenation proposed by Willem de Rose, which I discussed last time. Although one has to admit that the properties of recursivity and free and variable order that are important for de Rose's definition of this phenomenon, are not always applicable to these phenomena in Northwest Caucasian. what is important is that by far the largest set of lexical affixes in our languages express spatial meanings. These include simplex and complex locative prefixes, the so-called preverbs, which are really numerous. There are about 30 locative preverbs in Circassian, but the number in Abkhaz and Abaza reaches more than 100. There are also directional suffixes which are not so numerous, but they do exist and they are most prominent and productive in Circassian languages. These prefixes and suffixes often combine with each other. Some of these combinations are semantically opaque. Many combinations of prefixes and or suffixes with roots are lexicalized. And also, as I have already noted, many locative preverbs are replicatives. In fact, in Circassian, all locative preverbs are replicatives. And in Abkhaz and Abaza, this depends on how you count and how you define applicatives, but probably about 1/2 of this, quite a large number, work as applicatives. So here I give several simple examples of locative prefixes from standard Kabardien. And here one can note that the lexical roots, like lie, denoting position, and also those denoting directed motion, like go in and go out. So these lexical roots cannot occur without one among these locative preverbs. And the choice of the preverb depends on the spatial configuration of the event and also on the topological properties of the landmark expressed as an indirect object. And also in Kabardien and by Circassian, there is a default or dummy locative preverb, which is used well in those cases where any semantically more specialized preverb would not be appropriate. So basically, at least for a certain lexical class of verbal roots, locative prefixation is an obligatory grammatical category, if you wish, and quite an extended one. This slide shows directional suffixes and even circumfixes also in Kabardien. So there is a suffix denoting motion around the landmark. It usually transitivizes the verb. So they go around all parts of the village. Here the verb is transitive and the landmark is expressed as an absolute direct object. There are also certain combinations of suffixes and prefixes, like this combination of de and the ye, which denotes motion upwards. And this combination of the suffix and the prefix is opaque. The suffix doesn't occur without this particular prefix, and this particular prefix doesn't actually mean enclosure in this combination. And sometimes it doesn't even need an indirect object expressing the language. Now it's interesting to look at the locative preverbs of the Northwest Caucasian languages from a diachronic perspective. And if we do so, it turns out that they are all related to some kinds of incorporation. And it's important because in the literature, Northwest Caucasian languages have not been treated as languages with any sort of incorporation. And I'm going to argue against this receipt. So historically, most locative proverbs go back to incorporated nouns, mainly those denoting parts of the body or parts of some other objects. Whereas directional suffixes go back to verbs of displacement. Let's look at locative proverbs related to nouns first. So in West Caucasian, there is a proverb meaning being inside something in close contact with the container or going through something. And this is clearly related to the noun meaning intestines. There is also a locative prefix meaning near something, and this is clearly related to one of the words for mouth. But these are, of course, cases of clearly grammaticalized and the semanticized body part nouns, which have become affixes. However, some proverbs can be viewed as incorporated nouns even synchronically. Indeed, they denote the same object as the noun. They can host pronominal prefixes referring to the possessor of the noun if appropriate. Such proverbs are more widespread in Abaza and Abkhaz than in Circassian, but they're also found in Circassian. So I give some examples from Standard Kavardian again. So there is a noun had, and there is a verb take something from one's head, which clearly has this noun as an incorporate. There is a noun for hand, and there are also some verbs like take from one's hand, from one's hands, which also shows the same root as part of the verb. There are even some examples of incorporated non-relational nouns in West Circassian. For instance, this he goes with us along the way. So there is the noun way, sandwiched between the components of the verbal form. And interestingly, this noun is incorporated not just as part of the verbal stem, but rather as, if you wish, as an object of the instrumental or prolative applicative, which often denotes the path of motion with verbs like go. And I think it's at least in some varieties of Circassian, it's simply possible to express the same meaning by having this noun way as an indirect object introduced by this instrumental prolative applicative. So it's possible that the non-incorporated construction also exists. In Abaza, as I said, this phenomenon is better attested. So there are several body part nouns that can be incorporated. For instance, face. And as you see, this incorporated root is accompanied by a possessor prefix referring to the person whose face is discussed. So on the one hand, this is notionally the possessor of the body part, but syntactically it is an indirect object of the verb, of the complex verb. So this incorporated noun simultaneously works as an applicative. And it's also possible to incorporate some non-relational nouns. Here I give an example from Abkhaz with an incorporated winter. We have to keep the cattle during the winter, and this during the winter is expressed by a combination of a genuine locative preverb meaning under and the nominal root winter. And here I think it's important to mention that, well, you can find this verb in the Abkhaz dictionary, but you don't find in this dictionary verbs like, I don't know, to sleep during winter or something like that, which would be appropriate in sentences like, I don't know, bears sleep during winter, or people tend to sleep more during winter, or whatever. Nor do you find in Abkhaz incorporation of any other nominal denoting times of the year, seasons of the year. So there are a couple of verbs with incorporated winter, but there aren't any verbs with incorporated summer or spring or autumn, at least to my knowledge, which shows that this isn't actually productive. So even if I claim that Northwest Caucasian languages indeed show some kind of noun incorporation synchronically, this noun incorporation is really very peculiar because only locations incorporate, never patients or direct objects. The set of nouns that can incorporate is synchronically limited and idiosyncratic. And what this non-incorporation actually do is it feeds the set of locative affixes and applicatives, that is, it tends to be grammaticalized. And it is clear that probably many of the current locative prefixes started like something similar to the Abaza face, which isn't desemanticized, but then they underwent semantic bleaching and extension. And so we'll probably see several diachronic layers of these processes in these languages. So as I said, some directional suffixes can be analyzed as verbal roots. So this is a phenomenon of verb root serialization. And it actually has been recognized as incorporation by some scholars. So these affixes, some of these affixes can be used as roots of independent verbs with the same directional meaning, like go in, go down, etc. But importantly, these are verbal roots which always combine with locative preverbs. And so they aren't actually suffixes, but rather circumfixes, if you wish, and they not just introduce the directional meaning, but also the appropriate goal or source arguments by means of locative preverbs. So here are some examples. So to express something like to sit down between something or somebody, one combines the verbal root sit down with a verb consisting of the root enter, go in, and the locative proverb, in this case denoting enclosure, so the result is a complex verbal stem consisting of two roots and an appropriate locative proverb. And in a similar way, it is possible there is a verb to descend with the root he, which is lexicalized with a dative proverb. This dative proverb doesn't have any clear meaning in this root, but still it must be there. And this complex verb can incorporate other verbal roots like Luke or many others actually. And as a result, we have a complex verb meaning Luke down, literally, Luke descend. So in terms of multi-sense typology, the Northwest Caucasian polysynthesis is clearly transitional between the compounding or compositional and affixal types. So many lexical affixes actually have cognate roots, and some of them even retain the original semantics of these roots. So both noun incorporation and verb root serialization are in fact tested, contrary to what Matheson herself has written about abhors. But notably, they aren't productive. They apply to closed classes of roots. And importantly, incorporated roots tend to become grammaticalized, and in general, they pattern with affixes. So, actually running out of time, but I'd love to say something about morphological organization. It won't take too long, I think. So, as I said, morphological organization of Northwest Caucasian languages presents an intricate and complex interplay of templatic and scope-ordered principles. And this has been shown in a number of recent publications. So this is the schematic verbal template. I'm not going to discuss it in any detail. You can only see that it's really complex, contains many stems, many slots, both before the root and after the root, and importantly, these slots are organized in larger zones, such as argument structure zones, stem, the endings. These zones are organized according to different principles, and sometimes even sort of function independently of each other. So suffixes show more or less scope-based ordering. Closest to the roots are numerous actional modifiers that somehow pertain to the lexical meaning of the verb, but also those like do something excessively, do something again, etc. They all go here. Then comes aspect, then tense, then negation, and finally clause type, like declarative, interrogative, or subordinate. Prefixes can also be argued to show partial scope ordering. So subordinating prefixes are located farthest from the root, then comes potential, then those applicatives that are more compositional than those applicatives that are less compositional or lexicalized. But this ordering is only partial because the causative, which is almost always compositional and usually takes scope over at least lexicalized applicatives, but it can also take scope over the compositional applicatives. Still, the causative always occurs closest to the root. So its ordering doesn't obey scope. Caucasian even allows some limited reordering of suffixes depending on their mutual scope. At least the following elicited examples are reported. So there is, for instance, a simulative suffix meaning pretend to do something, and the refractive suffix, in this case, meaning do something again, and it's possible to order them in both ways, clearly reflecting their mutual scope. She pretended again that she was happy versus she pretended that she was happy again. But these examples are a result of elicitation, and anyway, it's rather exception than a rule to find this sort of variable ordering in these languages. It's very hard to elicit patterns as clear as this. The following examples show counterscopal ordering of prefixes from others. So in 23, you see that the causative, which is closest to the root, takes scope over not only over the root, but also over the applicative. And in 24, you see that the negation, which is also located quite close to the root, takes scope over quite a lot of things, like not only over the causative and the root, but also over the benefactive and the reflexive. So some prefixes follow the scopal order principles, but other violated or rather disregarded. We also find it in these languages quite a lot of phenomena that are called dependencies between non-adjacent slots. And these are usually associated with templatic morphology, because in scope-ordered morphology, the basic idea that you add affixes one by one, and if you do this, dependencies between non-adjacent slots simply can't arise. But they are attested, and probably the most fascinating example of this comes from Obich, where several distinct prefixal and suffixal positions are sensitive to the number of the absolutive argument. So depending on whether your absolutive is singular or plural, you have to choose between, if you wish, allomorphs of the causative, allomorphs of certain semi-suppletive roots, as well as certain suffixes on the other end of the word. And finally, in Circassian, one can find gratuitous affix mobility, like this third person plural indirect object prefix introduced by applicatives, it's simply floating. It normally is expected to occur immediately before its applicative, the applicative that hosts it, as in 26a, but it can also float over the directional prefix, probably depending on some phonotactic considerations. This phenomena is quite well attested and reported in the literature. But so far, no meaning behind it has been discovered. So to summarize, morphological organization in Northwest Caucasian isn't uniform. And moreover, it defies any straightforward analysis that would aim to reduce affix combinatorics and ordering either to semantic scope or to any kind of a rigid template. And of course, this complex system obviously reflects a complex history with different historical layers of successive grammaticalization and morphologization, as well as lexicalization. And in some cases, it is even possible to observe ongoing morphologization of certain auxiliary elements that become suffixes, or for that matter, of lexical roots that become prefixes, as I have shown. So to summarize, Northwest Caucasian languages adhere to the cross-linguistic prototype of polysynthesis, if there is any, and at the same time show a number of specific features betraying a complex and unique history. And of course, this is actually quite trivial, because any complex morphology reflects its own complex and unique history. But still, we have to, in order to understand it, we have to investigate this history to the extent possible in order to understand not only are the makings of this particular system, but also the possible and potential pathways whereby complex morphology emerges in the languages of the world. And Northwest Caucasian languages are instructive in this way. So these languages show extraordinary polypersonalism enhanced by an extremely rich system of applicatives, vestiges of different types and diachronic layers of incorporation in the system of lexical affixes and verbs, and a predominantly spatial profile of lexical affixation, which notably is an aerial feature, which even goes beyond the Caucasus, because, as I have mentioned earlier in my previous lectures, spatial prefixes are quite well attested in the languages of Europe. And last but not least, a complex mixture of scope-based and templatic morphological organization. Thank you very much for your attention. So, are there any questions or comments?
Else is ready to ask a question. I have one on slide 88 about those located preverbs, which
Yes.
Yeah, that really so yeah, I wanted to know, you said that they're obligatory. Are these full 10 ABC, are these full sentences, full clauses? Where is the main verb? Which leads to my question about the second part of the question, which I'll ask.
Yeah. No, these are not full clauses. These are rather, these are examples examples from a book by a native speaker linguist, a very prominent linguist, Mukhadin-Kumachov, who has contributed tremendously to the study of Circassian languages, also from a historical perspective. And so he has constructed these examples from his native speaker intuition, and they are, well, in line with the Russian tradition of giving sentences, well, of giving examples in the infinitive. They are all in the Mazda form and then in the non-finite form. But, well, importantly, they all lack subject, the absolutive arguments, the thing which is located. But it's, of course, it's possible to include it and possible to inflect these verbs for present tense, whatever is needed.
Sorry, the verbs or
the whole verbs.
What I was wondering if why would this could be interpreted if there is something on a plate or there is something on the cover, because it really reminded me of Tibetan languages where you have a very large number of semantically specialized existential and nominative verbs that look very similar in terms of their meaning to be inside a container, to be attached to something, to be lying on the surface and so on. In that case, they are full verbs that could form a clause, which is why I asked the first question as to whether these three verbs could act like an existential verb.
Well, if I understood you correctly, then no, the preverbs aren't, at least these preverbs, those shown in 10, they are bound morphemes that even don't have any clear etymology. And so they can't be used independent, they can't occur independently. And actually, in Circassian, the verbs like lie, sit, and stand can act as more desemanticized existential predicates, expressing location of certain participant in a specific spatial configuration with respect to the landmark, and this landmark is introduced and coded by locative preverbs. But in Abkhaz and Abaza, the situation is again different because at least certain morphemes that within verbs act as locative preverbs can in fact occur as verbs themselves. So for instance, do I have an example? Well, I don't have any example of this here, but for instance, there is in Abaza there was a proverb meaning on top of, so it can combine with various verbs. So I don't know, with sit or stand or probably write something on top of something. But it can also function as independent verb, meaning be located on top of something. And to my knowledge, quite a few preverbs, but not all, can work in this way. And this is actually an interesting parameter whereby Abkhaz and Abaza differ from Circassian languages, because Circassian languages don't do that.
So these are your examples here, basically like spatial adpositions. that may have a connection with verbs in the languages just mentioned?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, but could you please speak up a bit? This one.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, it is elicited, and well, I have even since there is a West Circassian corpus, I have even tried to look for these examples in the corpus, but I haven't found any. So it's not the way they speak or write, but still in these languages, morphology is productive to the extent that it's possible to construct something that speakers won't produce themselves or would produce only very rarely, but they will be able to accept and interpret it. And also, well, and this should not be confused with well, I'm not sure it probably will be a politically not quite correct joke, but it should not be confused with Caucasian hospitality, because in many cases, speakers have extremely robust judgments about things which are impossible. So, for example, I have tried eliciting recursive applicativization in Abaza. Well, not exactly recursive, but recursive by applicative stacking in Abaza. And most speakers I have consulted very robustly rejected. So it is productive, but it has its limits.
I had a question about this example.
Yes, please, Alex.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll probably need to repeat your question to the audience because.
Sure. Well, yeah, okay. I was interested in this example because, many languages distinguish dative from benefactive, and this language apparently co-expresses dative and benefactive with the same applicative. So one hypothesis one could perhaps make intuitively, and I wanted to ask what you thought about this, was in terms of semantic scope. One could imagine that maybe the dative interpretation would be the closer one to the root, as opposed to the benefactive, which could be more peripheral, so the red one. But then you mentioned that possibly the two interpretations are possible, right? So would you think in terms of semantic scope or things like this of argument structure?
Thank you, Alex. This actually your question raises several distinct issues. So first of all, dative and benefactive are in fact distinct in these languages because, especially in Circassian, there is the so-called dative applicative, which is peculiar in that it mainly introduces objects that are subcategorized by the lexical root. So for the verb like give or say, the recipient or addressee would be introduced by the dative applicative, never by the benefactive. The benefactive would have a different meaning. However, at the same time, it isn't possible to add the dative applicative just to any verbal root. So for the verb write, the only way to express the addressee of writing is by means of the benefactive. And so if we forget the second instance of the benefactive in this example, which makes it too complex and probably unnatural, so the simple combination of the benefactive with the root write is polysymos, because it can mean write to something, to somebody. It can mean writing for the benefit of somebody, like, I don't know, write a letter in support of somebody. And also a prominent meaning is to write instead of somebody, like if I don't want to write or can't write, you can write for me, and this would also be expressed by the benefactor. But none of these meanings can be expressed by the dative applicative, which is simply incompatible with this particular verb. And with respect to scope, I tend to agree. I haven't worked with this particular example with native speakers. I have to rely on Arkadiev Lander and Alexander Letuche's paper. So as far as I remember, they give two interpretations, but this interpretation is the first one, probably the more natural one, because indeed the applicative closest to the root encodes something which is a meaning which is more dependent on the meaning of the lexical root than just the very basic benefactive meaning. And anyway, the general tendency robustly observed in these languages is that wherever an applicative is lexicalized, it should occur closer to the root than other applicatives, if it's possible to combine them with this verb at all. Because again, as I said, Circassian languages allow applicative stacking much more freely than Abkhaz and Abaza. I hope I answered your question.
It's interesting because at the end of your talk, you showed that the placement of applicatives or morphology is sometimes, follows principles of semantic scope. Sometimes they do comply with expectations, but sometimes not. You have the causative, which was kind of an exception to this. So it's an exciting set of languages to make those tests. Fascinating data. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Any other questions or comments, please?
I have a really quick one about applicatives. You said there are several dozen about seems quite astonishing.
Most of them locative.
Oh, okay. That was you already answered the question. Very good. So, yeah. That's a very broad definition of applicative.
Well, the definition of applicative, I think it's straightforward because it simply relates to a morpheme that introduces an extra argument, and all of them introduce an extra argument. And they combine with these personal prefixes that cross-reference this argument. So basically, the Northwest Caucasian system of applicatives comprises, well, it can be roughly subdivided into so-called grammatical applicatives and locative applicatives. Grammatical applicatives include benefactive, malefactive, commutative, instrumental, which is more productive in some languages and less productive in others. Some languages have some other more specialized grammatical applicatives, but basically this is the set. But there are also lots of locative applicatives. Some of them more general in meaning, some of them are specialized. Many of them can be lexicalized because, for instance, there is a marvelous dictionary for Abaza, which specifically targets the combinations of lexical verbal roots with locative prefixes. And lists at least several thousand of these combinations, but it can be clearly observed that some of these proverbs occur with hundreds of verbs, while others occur with just a handful of verbs or with just one single verb. So in some cases, it is possible to clearly delineate the meaning of the applicative, while in other cases it's impossible because there is just a combination of a root with the prefix occurring in some position. It is a separate morpheme because other morphemes can occur between them, but the combination of the two is clearly lexicalized. So actually, it's fascinating and also highly challenging that this complex morphology it interfaces on the one hand with syntax, and it's in some way it is like syntax in that it works for the purposes of syntax, but on the other hand, it also interfaces with the lexicon, and sometimes in the ways that can only be interpreted in lexical terms, like the applicatives which are lexicalized, but still being applicatives in morphosyntactic terms.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Also from the distance.
Thank you. So I think our time is probably up. So thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks for your talk.
Yeah.
And discussion.
Большое спасибо.
And see you again next week in presence, I hope.
What is the topic next week?
The